Chapter 20. Saturday dinner time. By the time Mac arrived, she was in the kitchen, fresh coffee dripping, counters and table all cleaned up and ready for whatever magic he was prepared to show her. He walked in, placed more groceries on the counter, and smiled at her. "Are you ready?" She motioned toward the bag. "I thought we had everything already. Isn't that what's in my fridge?" "We had most of it, but I didn't buy any pasta. Remember?" She frowned, then shrugged. "Honestly, I don't." He withdrew a bottle of red wine from his bag and placed it on the table. She studied the label. "I've never seen this before," she said, eyeing it. "I'm not a huge fan of reds, but I do love whites and rose. Especially the sparkly stuff." She grinned. "Welcome to how real people eat," he said. "That's a cheap bottle of wine. It's good and it's local. Plus, it's absolutely perfect to have a glass while you're making pasta sauce with some of it too." "Interesting." She watched as he unpacked a few more mysterious items she didn't recognize. He shooed her away and said, "You work on the pasta. I'll work on the sauce." "If that meant anything to me," she said with a tilt of her lips, "then I would hop to it and get started." "Get your largest pot." He stopped, frowning at her. "I hadn't thought about that. Do you have pots?" She lifted her finger in the air. "I don't, but Nan does." She went to one of the pantry cupboards and opened it. "What size pot do you want?" He joined her, rubbing his hands. "Now this is what I'm looking for." He reached inside and pulled out a decent-sized pot with two small handles on opposite sides. "This Dutch oven will do." She looked at it curiously. She'd never heard the term before and didn't know how it could possibly apply. It wasn't an oven, and what on earth made it Dutch? Or was that what the Dutch called a pot? Not wanting to ask and to appear even more foolish, she closed the cupboard door and watched as he took it to the sink. "Give it a quick wash and a rinse and then fill it with water up to here," he said, drawing an imaginary line on the inside of the pot. Obediently, she stood at the sink and did as he asked. Cleaned and rinsed, she waited until the pan filled up. She shut off the water and looked back at him. "And put it on the large burner at the back of the stove," he instructed. He busily chopped onions and garlic, and she saw he had snagged another pot while she'd been filling hers. It was on the front burner. She sniffed the aroma coming from his pot as she lifted her pot to place on the back burner. With that done, she leaned in closer to sniff the pot in front of her. Muggs stretched up his front paws to the oven door and sniffed. Then he'd missed out on a lot of good smells now too. "What is this? Butter and garlic?" "Butter with a little bit of garlic, yes, and a bunch of herbs. If you use dried herbs, warming them releases the flavors." "I can definitely agree with that," she said. "I don't remember anything quite so aromatic." He chuckled, stirred the contents, dumped in freshly chopped onions and then added ground beef. She watched as he calmly took a wooden spatula and stirred the mix. "When do you know it's done?" "When the meat turns brown and the onions turn translucent," he said. "The garlic you don't really have to worry about because it cooks so fast." The combination was really getting her appetite going. "I don't know what else goes in there, but I want to snag a forkful right now." "That's exactly how it should smell," he said. She watched in fascination as he proceeded to add more ingredients. When she wondered what came next, he reached across and turned her pot of water on high. "Grab the olive oil," he said. She looked at him sideways. He lifted an eyebrow. "Surely you've had olive oil served with your fancy meals?" She nodded. "So, I'm looking for one of those little glass cruets that you pull a stopper from and pour?" His eyebrows shot up. "Maybe in your world, but in my world, we don't pour olive oil into a crystal jar just so we can pour it back out again." He chuckled. "Nobody has time for that." He pointed at the kitchen table. Beside the wine was another bottle. She picked it up and read the label. Olive oil. Isn't it supposed to say extra virgin? It does, he said. Read the fine print underneath. She squinted. I would have thought that fine print should be bigger. She handed him the bottle. It probably is on your bottles, he said in a dry tone. He took off the lid and poured some olive oil into the Dutch oven. I count to 3 and figure that's good. She looked at the amount swimming on the top of the water. How am I supposed to learn if you don't measure? Are you taking notes? He asked while he now chopped tomatoes and celery. She gasped, grabbed her phone off the counter, and started videotaping everything. I completely forgot. She hesitated, wondering if she should ask him to start again, but he must have caught a sense of what she would say because he held up a hand. Don't even bother. I am not starting over. She sighed. Okay, but on the video, could you at least tell me what you did and how much? 1 pound of ground beef, a couple smashed cloves of garlic, chop up a whole onion, and cooked until the meat is brown and the onion translucent. As for the herbs, well, that's a little hard to remember, he said. I'm a cook who doesn't measure. I add a bit of this and a bit of that. A bit of what this time? In the original group, he said, oregano and thyme and marjoram, some paprika. His voice trailed off as he dumped in his freshly chopped tomatoes, celery, and she wasn't sure what the other thing was. She leaned in and asked, What's that? It's a bay leaf. Not to worry, I'll pull it out before it's served. She'd never seen such a thing before. He'd taken a leaf, like one from her plants outside, and plunked it in his sauce. Instead of being bright green, it was dry-looking, brittle. He continued to add what looked like canned tomatoes. Why fresh and canned? Because it'll be too dry if I don't add some liquid, he said, and I didn't have quite enough fresh tomatoes. She nodded as if that made sense, but from her point of view, that was a ton of fresh tomatoes. Still, the aroma was kicking in beautifully. He pointed to the pot with the water and olive oil. Now get the salt and add it in that pot. Obediently, she walked to the table, picked up a salt shaker, and put in a couple shakes. He looked at her and said, More. She shook again. More. She shook again. More. Finally, she stared at him in exasperation. How much salt do you want in there? He pulled the top off, poured some into his hand, and dumped it into the pot of water. She gasped. That much salt is seriously bad for you. It's going into the water, he said. We're not drinking the water, and I'm not adding it to the sauce. We'll put pasta in the water. It will get just the right amount of flavor. Then we'll drain it so we leave all that salt behind. She frowned, not sure she believed him, muttering that too much salt was bad for their health. He ignored her, which was probably a good thing. Then he picked up the lid and shoved it on top of the pot of water with a little more force than was necessary. To get back at him, she picked up her cup and poured herself some coffee, but not him. He put the spoon down, crossed his arms over his chest, and glared at her. She shrugged. Well, it's not like you were being nice. I'm making you dinner. She wrinkled her nose. That's not fair. He stared at her in astonishment. Why is that not fair? You should pour me a cup of coffee when I'm making you dinner. You asked to make me dinner a while ago. So now you're taking something from a few days ago and bringing it forward to today to get your way. He stood there confused, then shook his head. Forget it. Nobody could work their way through that. She decided she should probably be nice anyway. He was a guest, after all. She picked up a clean mug out of Nan's stack of mugs and poured coffee for him, placing it beside him, and said, Thank you. Once again he looked at the cup and said, You said thank you. Isn't it me who was supposed to say thank you? You're welcome, she said, beaming a smile in his direction. He snorted and returned to stirring his pot. You and Nan have a lot in common. She looked at him suspiciously. I don't think you meant that in a nice way. She looked down at his cup and then back up at him. Just take a sip before you say anything, because I'm pretty sure that whatever comes out of your mouth won't be nice. Nan is a great woman, he said. She started to feel better. But she's also as nutty as a hatter sometimes. She slammed her cup down. Are you saying I'm crazy too? No, he said, but crazy is as crazy does. She stared at him, trying to understand. He waved a hand. Forget it. Now I'll let all this simmer. She checked on the contents in his pot that had somehow turned from being a lot of different chunks of ingredients, separate and distinct, into this beautiful-looking sauce. How did it go from one to the other so quickly? Cooking, he said succinctly. That's all it takes, leaving it alone to simmer. We'll add a bunch of peppers, and then we'll let it simmer some more while we have our coffee. She nodded. What about the pasta water? The pot is pretty full, so it'll take another 10 minutes to boil, maybe longer. Is this one of those dishes that's better the next day? She asked, eyeing the pot of spaghetti sauce suspiciously. She'd never seen anything quite like it. In a way, yes, he said. It's definitely something that gets better, with lots of time to simmer. So we can't eat it today? She stared at him in horror. I am, he said with a huge grin. I'm starving. So am I, she admitted. I had a sandwich earlier, but I also did a lot of work in my garden, so I'm tired too. He looked out at the garden and pointed to the far back corner. Right, and I almost forgot. Where's the cross? She walked toward the formal dining room table and pointed out the cross leaning against the little window. There. He stepped closer but didn't touch it for the longest moment. Then he picked it up and checked to see how the two pieces of wood stayed together. They've used a pinner. And that means what? It's not a nail, he said. Anybody could have used a nail, but they've used a pinner, which means somebody had good equipment, because this looks like an air compressor pinner. He rotated it in his hand. It's just as likely a father made it for their child to carve the name in and place where they wanted it. Help them deal with the loss of a friend. Which means it could have been anyone. Doreen bent closer to see what he was talking about. It looks like a staple. Almost, he said. This isn't from a staple gun though. It's much finer. And there are two of them. That's why what you see looks to be a staple. She didn't quite understand, but as long as he did, she was good with it. Does that mean anything to you? No. But we see similar items at crash sites and often at crime scenes. It's human nature to want to honor a difficult death. He set it back up in the window. I figure it had been made specifically for this purpose, she said, because you can see how evenly centered the crosspiece is and how the ends go down at an angle. It's not like this was just two jagged pieces of driftwood tied together. You're right, he said. Plus, Johnny is less scratched in as much as carved in. Exactly. But I don't understand why. I wondered about it and asked Penny if Johnny might have drowned like Paul Shore did. Mac turned to look at her. Was that the same year? She nodded slowly. Paul went missing in May just as the high floodwaters hit, she added. But Johnny didn't go missing until August, and the water should have dropped by then. Mac looked out at the creek as if thinking back. High water can start any time in May most years. There are always exceptions, depending on how much snow is up in the mountains and how quickly it comes down, which also depends on rainstorms and other types of weather. We can get heavy flash floods right through July. But you're right. By August, the lake level has dropped, and the creek itself has slowed down to a narrow, slow channel. By September, it's completely calm. Also, Johnny didn't swim well. Her words were quiet. So what's the chance he drowned accidentally? Or maybe had a little help, she emphasized. Then, whoever was there didn't want to leave him to be found, so moved him to a new location where nobody would ever find him. All plausible, he said, but remember that part about needing evidence. She pointed at the cross. That seems to indicate somebody thought maybe Johnny died in the creek. Sure. But we found it down at your place again, he said. Not quite, she said. It was up a bit. Maybe 10 feet away from my place. Close enough, he said. It's hardly worth arguing over. She shrugged. Well, I'd argue about it, she said. Otherwise, you just pin that one on me too. He groaned. Even if Johnny did drown in August, there would be a body at that time of year. And no, I wouldn't blame that on you. Unless there was another strange accident, she said. You know. Like, did a bridge collapse? Did a truck hit a bank and crash down a bridge? I mean, all kinds of terrible things could have gone wrong. But yes, I would say the likelihood of finding a body in the dry season would be in the 80 or 90% mark. Right, he said. So then we're back to maybe Johnny drowned and was moved, she said. Or there was a fight, and maybe somebody held him underwater too long and killed him. You realize that a person can drown in just like 2 inches of water? And again we're guessing, Max said in a dry tone. Have you ever considered writing novels? You have a vivid imagination. I know, she said. But once my mind gets locked on a problem, it won't let go. I noticed. He walked back to the stove and gave the saucepot a stir. Doreen joined him, watching over his shoulder, and could see these lighter-colored bubbles popping up through the center before Mac turned them under into the mixture. Then he lifted the lid on the pot of water and put it back down again. It's a nice little stove, he said. She nodded. It looks nice, fancy, modern. In a way, it almost doesn't fit the atmosphere of my kitchen, for that reason alone. Sure, but you're learning, he said. And you're a blend of old and new yourself. I certainly am while living here. I could go check up and down the creek for more evidence, she said thoughtfully. The only thing is, it's been 29 years. True, he said, but you still found the cross. Goliath and Muggs did. At that, Thaddeus squawked. Thaddeus did. Thaddeus did. She reached out her arm and Thaddeus walked up it. Where have you been, big guy? Mac asked, stroking his feathery back. She could tell Thaddeus had just woken up. He sleeps a lot, she said. Is that normal? No clue. But then we are doing lots of activities, she said thoughtfully. So he likely needs his beauty rest when he can get it. Thaddeus sat on her shoulder and pecked at her ear. He's hungry, she said in surprise. She looked around, and sure enough, all the animals' food bowls were empty. She groaned. I still can't seem to get in the habit of feeding them at a regular time. So does it mean he's hungry when he pecks you? Mac asked, studying the bird. Did he hurt you? She shook her head. No, not at all. Heading to the front closet, Doreen got Thaddeus's food and placed a little on the kitchen table. Immediately, Thaddeus hopped off her shoulder and sat on the table, pecking away at his food. And then, out of the corner of his eye, his gaze fixed on the green piece of celery stalk left over from Mac's chopping tasks. Thaddeus hopped up to the countertop, walked over, and pecked at it. Doreen glanced at Mac. Do you mind? He shook his head. It's going in the garbage anyway. He moved it over to the kitchen table, so Thaddeus could have better access. Between the bird seeds and the celery, Thaddeus appeared to be quite content. She fed Goliath then, but he only made his appearance when she banged her spoon against his bowl and placed it on the floor. Then he was right here, winding between her legs. I already put it down for you, silly, she said affectionately, reaching down to rub his ears. As soon as she did that, his nose came up high enough that the aroma of his food hit the right spot, and he launched himself forward and started to eat, crouched down on all fours. Mac chuckled. At least they enjoy their food. Yeah, they do, she said. She fed Muggs, who seemed to be much less interested in his dog food than in the pot on the stove. Mac noted Muggs's focus and shook his head. Oh no you don't, big guy. Just then, the front door bell rang. Mac looked at Doreen, his eyebrows raised. She shrugged. I don't have a clue. She picked up a towel, wiped her hands, and walked to the front door. The alarms weren't set because she and Mac were inside. She opened the front door and found Hornby, grinning like a crazy man. He pushed past her and said, I thought I'd come by and have that cup of coffee. Don't bother, she snapped, pointing toward the front door. Get out. Why should I, he said. It's obvious you live all alone and need somebody to keep you company, he said with a half leer, half sneer. Insulted, she shook her head. Get out or I'll call the cops. Muggs, who had followed her, obviously didn't like her tone of voice because he growled at Hornby. Hornby looked down at Muggs. God, he's ugly. She gasped. Don't say that. She stepped to the fireplace and picked up her poker. She marched up to him and held it out like she would hit him. Get out of my house. He laughed at her. Oh my. Aren't you so cute? What's the matter? How come you're not friendly to a single guy like me? I just want some company too. I choose my own company, thanks, and you're not on the invitation list, Doreen snapped. Now get out. Then she noticed his gaze roaming the living room, looking appraising LY at all the knickknacks and furniture. She took a few more steps toward him, threateningly. Get out now. He turned to sneer at her. Or what?